It's Outside the Book, coming to you from the Southern Kentucky Bookfest 2015. I'm your host, Barbara Deeb. And as we do every year, we go behind the scenes with the authors, beyond the written word. And we are very excited to have with us this day Diana Gabaldon, who is the headliner for this year's festival. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's lovely to be here.
You know, we do this show on an annual basis, and as I mentioned to you, we've had lines outside the building, but never lines like we've seen here today.
No?
You, of course, are the author of the very popular Outlander series of books. In addition, it's now been adapted into a television series.
That's right.
And you have a lot of fans out there.
Well, thank you very much. I'm extremely flattered that they'd, spend their Saturday with me, or rather, I should say, with us, because you have a lot of other excellent authors here today as well. So
you have such a fascinating background. We've got a little bit of time to talk about some of those things.
If you like.
Now, you come from the West, the Arizona area,
That's right.
born and raised, and your background relates nothing to what we find in your books. So share a
Oh,
little
no.
bit about that. Zoology, oceanography.
Well, the fact is that I knew from a very early age, from about 8, that I was meant to write novels. I knew that was my calling, so to speak. But I came from a very conservative family background. My father was fond of saying to me, "You're such a poor judge of character, you're bound to marry some bum," he said. So be sure you get a
Thanks,
good
Dad.
education so you can support your family. So with that going on at home, I thought perhaps I wouldn't announce that I wanted to write books. I understood, even at that tender age, that
Were
it was
you one
rather...
of those closeted writers, though, as you grew? I mean, were you
No,
constantly writing?
No, I never
No.
wrote anything until I started. Well, I shouldn't say anything. I wrote a ton of different things, but it was all nonfiction. But I still knew I was supposed to be a novelist, even though I went into science, and I liked science. I was good at it. I enjoyed teaching, but I knew I was still supposed to be a novelist. And when I turned 35, I said to myself, "Well, Mozart was dead at 36. Maybe you better get a move on here."
Get on it.
And so I said, "All right, I'm going to write a book." For practice. Not going to show it to anyone, not going to tell anyone what I'm doing. It's just for me to learn how to write a novel. Because to that point I had written all kinds of things, PhD dissertations and scholarly journal articles and popular science and textbooks and
But
Walt
wait,
Disney
I got to
comic
back
books.
up here.
Yeah.
Popular science and textbooks, she says, but also you wrote comic books
Comic books, yes.
for Disney?
Yes.
How did that play into the picture?
Well, it was sort of not quite an accident. My mother taught me to read when I was about 3, in part by reading me Walt Disney comic books. And I kept on reading them. When I was 28, I think, I was reading one and I said, "Well, this is pretty bad. I bet I could do better myself." So I found the name and address of the editor who handled that line, and I sent him this rather rude letter and said, "Dear sir, I've been reading your comic books for the last 25 years. They've been getting worse and worse." He said, "I don't know that I could do better myself, but I'd like to try." And luckily, I met Del Connell, a gentleman with a sense of humor. He wrote back and said, "Okay, try." And he sent me a format so I could see what a script looked like. I wrote him a story. He didn't buy it, but he did something much more valuable. He told me what was wrong with it. And he did buy my second story, and I continued to write for him for the next year and a half until the powers that be at Disney said, "We have 40 years worth of Carl Barks scripts in our files.
Oh.
Why are we buying new ones?" So,
There you go. Now let's back up. Okay, so mind you, with the popularity of this Outlander series of books and the adaptation to television, Diana tells us that she did this just to see if she could write a novel. Always knew she was going to be a novelist. So it took 18 months to write it, the
yes.
first book. 18 months for the publisher to say, "Okay, we're going to publish it."
Well, no, they actually bought it in 3 days, but it took
okay.
them another 18 months to decide what to call it, because these books have no genre, or else they have all of them, and that's a problem from a marketing point of view.
Originally, it was to be called A Stitch in Time.
Well, I called it Cross Stitch, was my
Okay.
working title, and it was published under that title in the UK. The U.S. people said, "Well, we love the book, but can't you think of something more exciting that sounds like embroidery?" And so I thought of Outlander, and they said, "Oh, great." We then sold it in the UK 6 months later, and they said, "Well, we love the book, but we can't call it Outlander, because to us, an Outlander is someone from South Africa. Can you think of something else?" And I said, "Well, my working title was Cross Stitch," and so that's what they called it.
I gotcha. Talk about the fact that when you started writing, the voice, and I've heard many writers talk about this, how sometimes the characters just really take over.
Yeah, they
And in
do.
this sense, it was a female voice that became dominant.
Well, I decided to write a novel and said, what's the easiest kind of book I could write? In a sense, making it hard is for practice. And I said, well, for me, maybe historical fiction. I was a research professor. I knew my way around a library. I said, okay, historical fiction seems easier to look things up than make them up. And if I turn out to have no imagination, I can steal things from the historical record, so, which works really well. And so I said, okay, fine, historical novel. Where shall I set this? Because I've got no background in history to speak of. So I was casting around looking for a useful time and place when I saw a really old Doctor Who rerun on public television. And I imagine your audience is familiar with Doctor Who. It was one of the really old Patrick Troughton episodes in which the Doctor had picked up a young Scotsman from 1745. And this young man appeared in his kilt. And I said, well, that's kind of fetching. I found myself still thinking about this the next day. I'm in church, and I said, well, you want to write a book, it doesn't matter where you set it. The important thing is pick a point, get started. Fine, Scotland, 18th century. So that's where I began, knowing nothing about Scotland or the 18th century, having no plot, no outline, and no characters. Nothing but the rather vague images conjured up by the notion of a man in a kilt, which is, of course, very powerful and compelling.
Very powerful. And then this female voice, because time travel plays a big role.
Yes, it's all her fault.
Blame it on her.
No, I began writing immediately, but I also began doing the research immediately and learned just a little bit about the Jacobite Rebellion, essentially Scots versus English. And about the third day of writing, I said, well, I must have a lot of Scotsmen, of course, because of the kilt factor. But I think it would be good if I had a female character, then we would have sexual tension. That's good. So if she's English, so we'll have lots of conflict. So on the third day, I introduced an English woman into the plot. Well, I didn't have a plot at that point, but I loosed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. Well, she walked in. They're all muttering to each other around the fire. They turned around and stared at her. I'm thinking, why? What's wrong? Why are they looking at her like that?
She wasn't wearing a kilt.
Well, she was a little odd looking. And one of them stood up and he said, my name's Dougal Mackenzie, and who might you be? And without my stopping to think, I just typed, my name's Claire Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you? And I said, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person. So I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her talk like a historical person. She wasn't having any of this. She just kept making smart-ass modern remarks. And she also took over and started telling the story herself. I said, all right, I'm not going to fight with you all the way through this book. I said, no one's ever going to see this. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do. Go ahead and be modern. I'll figure out how you got there later. So it's all her fault that there's time travel.
And what people don't realize is that you began writing the first in the series of Outlander books in the late 80s.
That's right. I began on March 6, 1988.
And so here we are today, extremely popular. You're in over 20 countries in
42.
over 20, in different languages,
38.
38 now. Okay, I need to update my information.
Well, it's probably Wikipedia that's wrong. It has 26 million copies in print is the third stat.
But we also now have a television series.
We do, luckily.
An
It's wonderful.
extremely popular television
Yeah, I
series.
couldn't be more pleased.
Stars
They've done
Channel.
just a wonderful job with it.
Do you get to input on the TV series?
I do. I am officially a consultant on the show, and they send me outlines, they send me scripts, and best of all, I get to see all of the daily footage that they shoot. So I see every day, what they've been doing.
Was that, which is not, doesn't always happen that way.
No,
Diana.
luckily for me.
How is
I
it
did.
that you negotiated that, or?
No, when we signed the contract, my agent said, a consultant can mean anything or nothing, and it depends how well they like you or if they think you have anything to offer. As it is, though, I got along extremely well from the beginning with Ron Moore, the showrunner, and his production partner, Merrill Davis, and they were kind enough to come out to my house and spend 2 days with me talking about characters and backstory and plot lines and things like that. And we found that we were very much on the same wavelength. So, cautiously after they began production, they began showing me things, and I was extremely diplomatic in what I said about them.
And here we go.
And, little by little, they began to trust me, and I began, I had no choice but to trust them. And we get along very well.
So where are we at now? I mean, you've done what you set out to do at the age of 8. I'm going to be a novelist. Could you ever have imagined in your wildest dreams that you would be this successful, really?
I could have imagined it, but I didn't think so. My plan was, I was writing Outlander for practice. I thought, once I know what it takes to do a book, then I can, pick a genre that I like
Then I'll do
mystery.
my real
and,
book,
yeah,
right?
then I'll write a book that I mean to get published, and I probably will. I mean, I knew I was a reasonably good, competent writer, and I said, so then I'll probably spend like 12 years working my way up through the mid-list, and maybe become a bestseller around the age of 50 or so. At which point, maybe I can retire from science and do it full time. Anyway, it just kind of worked faster.
You can definitely retire, probably. So where do we go from here? What's next?
Well, let's see. The second half of season 1 has just begun for the show, as doing extremely well, which does great things for your book sales. My editor called last week to say, well, Outlander is number 4, number 8, and number 10 on various permutations of the New York Times list this week. It has actually hit number 1 on a couple of them, on a couple of occasions.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I
And
appreciate that.
continued success.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. We've been talking with author Diana Gabaldon.